The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "You're fired." But Sergio Monti, the man they called the Shadow King of the underworld, wasn't prepared for what happened next. Instead of a scream, instead of a plea for mercy in a room filled with the city's most dangerous killers, there was only a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Greta Lombardo didn't flinch. She didn't let the silver tray in her hands tremble, even though her entire world had just been dismantled with 5 cold words. Before we dive into the heart of this incredible journey of power, pride, and a sacrifice that changed everything, I want to welcome you all to our storytelling family. We are so glad you're here with us today. If you love stories that touch the soul and challenge the heart, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to hear a story about true strength. And do me a huge favor. Drop a comment below telling me which city or country you're watching from. We love seeing how far our family reaches across the globe. Now let's go back to that tense, dimly lit lounge where a billionaire mafia boss made the biggest mistake of his life. Greta slowly placed her tray on the polished mahogany table, her eyes meeting Sergio's icy gaze with a terrifying level of grace. "I hope you find the piece you're looking for, Mr. Monti," she said, her voice a soft, steady anchor in the room. "You look like you need it." She didn't wait for a rebuttal. She simply turned and walked out, leaving the most powerful man in the city paralyzed by her lack of fear. The heavy oak doors closed with a final, echoing thud, and Greta stepped out into the biting chill of a New York downpour. The rain was relentless, soaking through her thin waitress uniform in seconds, but she barely felt the cold. Her mind was already spinning through the soul-crushing mathematics of poverty. $12. That was the total of her tips from the night. Hardly enough for a gallon of milk and the fever reducer Sylvia needed. She walked toward the subway, her shoes squelching in the puddles, calculating the cost of survival. If they skipped dinner tonight and tomorrow, they could maybe stretch their bread until Friday. If she walked the 40 blocks home instead of taking the train, she'd save $2.75. Every penny was a heartbeat, every nickel a breath for the sister she had sworn to protect since their parents had left them with nothing but a mountain of debt and a surname that felt like a curse. Greta pressed her back against the wet brick of an alleyway for a moment, letting the darkness swallow her. She and Sylvia Vitali had grown up in the shadows of these very buildings, 2 girls who had learned to find beauty in the cracks of the sidewalk, but tonight, the cracks felt like they were widening into a canyon. Back in the ivory tower of the Monti estate, the atmosphere was just as suffocating, but for a different reason. Sergio Monti stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the rain wash over the city he supposedly owned. He held a gold lighter, the flame flickering against the glass, reflecting a man who had everything and felt nothing. He had fired her as a test, a clinical, heartless experiment to see if he could still feel the rush of breaking someone. He had expected her to crawl. He had expected her to offer him information, or her dignity, or her tears in exchange for the steady paycheck she so clearly needed. But her parting words had bypassed his defenses like a ghost. "You look like you need it." No one spoke to him that way. No one looked past the tailored Italian suits and the scars to see the hollow vacuum where his soul used to be. He found himself pacing the length of his office, the smell of her cheap, lavender detergent still lingering in the air, clashing with the expensive scent of his mahogany and tobacco. He was haunted by the way she hadn't looked at the guns holstered at his men's sides, but rather at the exhaustion in his own eyes. Sergio snapped the lighter shut, the metallic click sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. He picked up the phone, his voice a low growl that startled his assistant. "Find out where she went," he commanded. "And find out who Sylvia is." He told himself it was about security, about ensuring she wouldn't talk to the rival families. But deep down, in the part of him he tried to bury, he knew it was something else. He was a man who had mastered the art of fear, and he had just met the only person in the world who was truly beyond his reach. As Greta finally reached the door of their crumbling apartment, shivering and exhausted, she forced a smile onto her face. She couldn't let Sylvia see the terror behind her eyes. She had to be the shield, even if the shield was starting to shatter. Little did she know, the Shadow King was already watching from the darkness, and the test he had started was about to become a war that neither of them was prepared to lose. This was only the beginning of a tragedy that would prove some worlds are simply too dark for light to survive. Stay tuned for the next chapter, family, because the price of Sergio's obsession is about to be paid in blood. The obsession didn't stay behind the closed oak doors of the executive suite. It followed Sergio Monti like a restless ghost into the dead of the night. He sat in the back of his darkened sedan, the glowing tip of a cigarette the only light in the cabin, watching the GPS tracker on his phone move slowly through the jagged streets of the city's poorest district. He had sent his two most efficient shadows, Dante and Luca, to follow the girl, but their reports through the earpiece weren't satisfying the strange itch in his chest. He needed to see it for himself. He needed to understand how a woman with a terminal bank account could look at a king and feel pity instead of terror. As the car pulled into the mouth of a crumbling alleyway, Sergio rolled down the window, letting the scent of rain, trash, and desperation fill the leather-bound luxury of his world. He watched through the shadows as Greta emerged from a bodega, clutching a single brown paper bag like it contained gold. She looked smaller here, dwarfed by the looming, graffiti-scarred tenements. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of a fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. Just as she reached the rusted gate of her apartment building, three figures emerged from the gloom. The vultures, low-level street thugs who picked the bones of the neighborhood's poor. Sergio felt his jaw tighten as he watched them corner her, their laughter echoing off the brick walls like the cackle of hyenas. One of them reached out, snatching the bag from her hands and dumping its meager contents, a loaf of bread, 2 apples, and a bottle of generic fever medicine, onto the wet pavement. Sergio waited for her to scream, waited for her to beg them, just as he had expected her to beg him hours earlier. But the air remained still. Greta simply looked down at the medicine rolling into the gutter, her expression not one of fear, but of a devastating, hollowed-out acceptance. It was then that the revelation hit Sergio with the force of a physical blow. Her calm in his office hadn't been a tactic or a show of strength. It was the exhaustion of someone who had already been broken so many times that there was nothing left to shatter. She wasn't brave. She was finished. She was a person who had looked into the abyss so long that a mafia boss's threats felt like a summer breeze compared to the winter in her soul. He watched her stoop down, her movements slow and mechanical, to retrieve the medicine bottle while the thugs jeered, one of them stepping on the bread she had bought with her last few cents. She didn't even look up at them. She just clutched the plastic bottle to her chest and waited for them to tire of the sport. In that moment, the test Sergio had devised felt pathetic and small. He had tried to play God with a woman who was already living in hell. As the vultures finally drifted away, leaving her shivering in the rain, Sergio leaned back into the shadows of his car, his heart hammering a rhythm he didn't recognize. He realized that by firing her, he hadn't just tested her loyalty. He had pulled the last thread of a life that was already unraveling. He watched her disappear into the dark maw of the building, the heavy iron door clanging shut behind her, and for the first time in his life, the Shadow King felt the cold. He realized he didn't want to break her anymore. He wanted to know what happened to the man who had let a flame like hers get so close to going out. He signaled his driver to move, but as the car pulled away, Sergio couldn't shake the image of her eyes that had seen the end of the world and decided it wasn't worth crying over. The investigation was no longer about security or rivals. It was about a man trying to find a spark of humanity in the wreckage he had helped create. The following morning, The sun didn't so much rise as it did bleed through the smog of the district, casting a sickly yellow light over the cracked linoleum of Greta and Sylvia's kitchen. Greta sat at the small, chipped table, watching the steam rise from a single cup of hot water she'd flavored with the last of a lemon wedge. Her body ached with a deep, structural fatigue, the kind that rest couldn't reach, but her mind was already moving, scanning the mental classifieds for any job that would take a woman with no references and a desperate timeline. The silence of the apartment was broken by a sharp, rhythmic pounding at the door, not the frantic kick of a debt collector, but the heavy, authoritative knock of someone who owned the air they breathed. Greta stood, her heart performing a slow, heavy thud against her ribs, and pulled the door open to find a man in a charcoal suit that cost more than the building's entire monthly rent. He didn't speak. He simply held out a heavy, black leather gym bag, his eyes hidden behind dark aviators. "From Mr. Monty," the man said, his voice as mechanical as a clock. He set the bag on the floor and vanished back into the dim hallway before Greta could even draw a breath to protest. She stared at the bag for a long time, the black leather looking like a predatory animal curled at her feet. When she finally reached down and zipped it open, the sight was blinding. Stacked rows of high-denomination bills, more money than she had seen in her entire life, more money than her father had owed in his darkest hour, enough to buy 1,000 bottles of medicine and a new life for Sylvia in a city where the air was clean. It was blood money, a billionaire's way of washing his hands of a guilty conscience, and for a moment, the temptation was a physical weight in her lungs. She could take it. She could save Sylvia. She could end the war with the vultures right now. But as she looked at the currency, she saw Sergio's cold, gold lighter and the way he had dismissed her like a piece of broken furniture. He didn't want to save her. He wanted to buy her silence, or worse, he wanted to buy the right to feel like a good man without actually being one. By the time Sylvia woke up, coughing and asking about the noise, Greta had already zipped the bag back up. Her face was a mask of cold, hard granite. She didn't say a word as she pulled on her damp coat, gripped the heavy handles of the bag, and headed back toward the one place she had vowed never to see again. The trip back to the Monty estate felt longer than the walk home had been, the weight of the millions pulling at her shoulders, but her resolve only tightened with every block. When she reached the club, the polished brass doors felt like the entrance to another planet. The bouncer, a mountain of a man who had seen her scrub floors 100 times, stepped forward to block her path, but something in Greta's eyes made him hesitate. It wasn't anger, it was a terrifying, quiet sovereignty. She pushed past him and marched straight toward the private lounge, the black bag swinging at her side like a weapon. The room was empty except for Sergio, who was sitting at the bar, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked up, his eyes widening with a rare flash of genuine shock as Greta walked to the center of the room. Without a word, she hoisted the bag and swung it onto the mahogany bar with a deafening crash that made the crystal glasses rattle. The sound echoed in the vast, opulent space, a declaration of war disguised as a rejection. "I am not your charity case, Mr. Monty," she said, her voice echoing off the gold-leafed ceiling, steady and sharp enough to draw blood. "You discarded me because you wanted to see if I'd break. You don't get to fix that with paper. You don't get to buy the dignity you try to take." Sergio stood slowly, the ice clinking in his glass, his face unreadable but his hands slightly tightening on the bar. For the first time in his life, he was looking at someone he couldn't control, someone who saw the massive wealth behind him and found it worthless. Greta leaned in, her shadow falling over the Shadow King, and her voice dropped to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. "Keep your money. Use it to buy a conscience, if you can find one for sale. But stay away from my door." She turned her back on him and the millions of dollars, walking out with the same hauntingly calm grace she'd shown the night before. Sergio remained at the bar, staring at the black bag, the the silence of the lounge suddenly feeling like a cage. He realized then that he hadn't just failed to break her. He had managed to do something far more dangerous. He had made her the only thing in the world he truly respected, and in his world, respect was a death sentence for the heart. He watched the doors swing shut behind her, finally understanding that Greta Lombardo didn't need his money to be powerful. She was already the most powerful person he had ever met, and he was the one who was truly poor. The rejection of the money had left a tremor in the underworld that was invisible to the citizens above, but deafening to the predators below. As Greta walked away from the Monty estate for the second time, her head held high and her pockets empty, she was no longer just a ghost in a uniform. She had become a flare in the dark. High above the street, in a sleek, glass-fronted office that rivaled Sergio's in its coldness, a man named Lorenzo Vitali watched her through a pair of high-powered binoculars. Vitali was a man built of sharp angles and old grudges, the head of the family that had been bleeding the Monty territory for decades. He had seen the entire exchange, the way that Ice Boss had stood paralyzed as a common waitress threw millions of dollars back in his face, and more importantly, the way Sergio had watched her leave. Vitali leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face as he tapped a rhythm on his desk. He had spent years looking for a crack in Sergio Monti's armor, searching for a single thread of humanity he could pull to make the whole empire unravel. He had tried bombs, betrayals, and business wars, but Sergio had always remained untouchable, a man with no heart to pierce. Until now. The girl, Vitali whispered into the quiet room, the words tasting like a victory. The one who thinks she's too proud for his money. She isn't just a waitress anymore. She's a map. He turned to his lead enforcer, a scarred man who stood in the shadows of the doorway. Sergio didn't kill her for that insult. He didn't even have her dragged back. He just watched her. He's curious, and in our world, curiosity is a fatal vulnerability. Vitali understood the physics of the underworld better than anyone. If a man like Sergio Monti develops a soft spot, it becomes a target that everyone can see. By refusing the money, Greta had inadvertently painted a bullseye on her own back. She was no longer a person to Vitali. She was a lever. If he could take her, he could make the Shadow King do anything. He could force a retreat, demand territory, or watch the great Sergio Monti crumble into the dirt while begging for a girl's life. Meanwhile, Greta met Sylvia at the corner of their block, unaware that the air around them had turned lethal. They walked arm in arm, two friends sharing a single umbrella against the drizzling rain, talking about mundane things like the price of eggs and the hope of a shift at a local diner. They felt like they were winning because they were together, but the shadows behind them were growing longer and more disciplined. Every step they took was being recorded. Every corner they turned was being mapped by Vitali's scouts. The vultures who had harassed Greta the night before were suddenly gone, replaced by professionals who didn't want her pocket change. They wanted her soul. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks across the Manhattan skyline, Vitali picked up a phone and dialed a number that went straight to a burner. "Begin the watch," he commanded, his voice devoid of any mercy. "I want to know where she sleeps, who she loves, and exactly when she feels safest. Sergio thinks he found a toy to play with. We're going to show him that toys break." Greta climbed the stairs to her apartment, feeling a strange chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She paused at the landing, looking back down the dim stairwell, sensing eyes she couldn't see. She didn't know that she had become the most valuable currency in the city. She didn't know that by asserting her dignity, she had signed a contract with a devil far more patient than Sergio. To the world, she was still just Greta, the girl with $12 in tips and a sick sister. But to the monsters waiting in the dark, she was the mark, the single point of failure in an empire that had stood for a century. The trap was being set, the bait was walking home, and the Ice Boss, was about to learn that the only thing more dangerous than having no heart is finally finding one. The morning air was thick with a gray, suffocating fog that seemed to swallow the sounds of the city, leaving the streets of the district eerily quiet. Greta walked beside Sylvia, their shoulders touching as they navigated the cracked pavement toward the local school. They were laughing about a shared memory from their childhood, a time they had tried to bake a cake with stolen flour and rainwater. But the laughter felt thin, a fragile shield against the growing sense of dread that had been following Greta since she left the club. Sylvia squeezed Greta's hand, her fever finally broken but her face still pale. "You're worrying again, G," Sylvia whispered, her eyes searching her friend's face. "The vultures are gone. Maybe you actually scared them off." Greta tried to smile, but the expression died before it reached her eyes. She didn't have the heart to tell Sylvia that vultures only left when a bigger predator moved into the territory as they turned the corner into the narrow alleyway that served as a shortcut to the school gates. The silence suddenly felt heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. A black van with tinted windows was idling at the curb, its engine a low, predatory growl. Greta stopped dead, her instincts screaming, but before she could shove Sylvia back toward the main road, the side door slid open with a violent hiss. Two men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas, blurred into the space between them. Everything happened with the terrifying efficiency of a practiced nightmare. Greta felt a gloved hand clamp over her mouth, the scent of chemicals and stale sweat filling her senses as she was hoisted off her feet. "Greta!" Sylvia's scream tore through the fog, a raw sound of pure terror. She lunged forward, her small fist striking out with the desperate bravery of someone who had nothing left to lose, but one of the men backhanded her with a sickening thud. Greta watched in a haze of horror as her best friend collapsed onto the wet concrete, her head striking the curb. "Let her go," Greta tried to shout, but the words were smothered by the hand over her face. She fought with every ounce of her strength, her fingernails clawing at the man's neck, her boots kicking against the interior of the van, but the door slammed shut, plunging her into total darkness. The van roared to life, tires screeching against the asphalt, leaving Sylvia lying motionless in the gutter, alone in the gray morning light. Hours later, in the cold, clinical silence of the Monti estate, Sergio sat behind his desk, staring at a map of the city's shipping docks. His mind was miles away, stuck on the image of Greta's face as she had rejected his money, that look of pure, unadulterated sovereignty that he couldn't stop thinking about. The peace he had been looking for, the peace she had wished for him, felt further away than ever. The heavy doors to his office burst open, and Dante entered, his face ashen, carrying a small, brown cardboard box. He didn't say a word. He simply placed the box on the mahogany desk and stepped back, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. Sergio didn't move for a long moment. He knew the weight of that silence. He reached out, his fingers steady but his heart beginning to thud with a rhythmic, sickening dread. He pulled the tape back, the sound of it tearing like skin. Inside, nestled atop a bed of white tissue paper that looked like a shroud, was the white waitress apron Greta had worn for a year. It was no longer pristine. The fabric was stiff with dried, brownish-red stains, blood that looked like a map of a war he hadn't realized he was fighting. Tucked into the folds of the cloth was a single, handwritten note on heavy, embossed stationery. "The Ice King finally found something that can melt. We have the girl. You have 1 hour to decide what your empire is worth." Vitali, Sergio felt the temperature in the room plummet. He picked up the apron, the fabric rough against his skin, and the scent of her lavender detergent hit him, now mingled with the metallic tang of violence. The test was over. The game had turned into a slaughter. He didn't shout. He didn't throw the desk or demand blood in a fit of rage. Instead, a terrifying, absolute calm settled over him, the kind of calm Greta had shown him, but forged in the fires of hell. He stood up, the blood-stained apron still clutched in his hand, and looked at Dante. "Mobilize everyone," Sergio said, his voice a whisper that carried the weight of 1,000 deaths. "I want the city locked down. And someone get me the name of the hospital where they took Silvia Vitali." He walked toward the door, leaving the Shadow King behind. For the first time in his life, Sergio Monti wasn't going to war for territory or pride. He was going to war for a waitress who had told him he looked like he needed peace, and he was prepared to burn the entire city to the ground to find it. The tragedy was already written in the blood on the apron, but the ending was still being forged in the dark. The sirens of the city were silenced by the rhythmic, heavy thrum of 3 black SUVs tearing through the industrial district, a convoy of death headed straight for the heart of Vitali's territory. Inside the lead vehicle, Sergio Monti sat in absolute stillness, checking the slide on his customized pistol with a mechanical precision that bordered on the holy. He wasn't a man fueled by the hot, messy rage of a lover. He was fueled by the cold, absolute resolve of a king whose crown had been spat upon. He didn't just want Greta back. He wanted to remind the world why the shadows belonged to him. As the vehicles breached the perimeter of the abandoned cannery Vitali used as a fortress, Sergio didn't wait for a tactical breach. He signaled the lead driver to ram the corrugated steel gates, the sound of the impact echoing like a thunderclap through the hollowed-out neighborhood. The moment the SUVs screeched to a halt inside the courtyard, the air turned to lead and fire. Sergio stepped out into the chaos, his long wool coat billowing behind him like a shroud. He didn't take cover. He moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, his weapon an extension of his will. Every time his finger pulled the trigger, a life was snuffed out, not with passion, but with the efficiency of an accountant balancing a ledger. Vitali's men, hardened killers who had survived a dozen turf wars, found themselves paralyzed by the sight of him. This wasn't the ice boss they knew. This was a force of nature that had finally found a reason to stop pretending to be human. He moved through the lobby and up the concrete stairs, leaving a trail of brass casings and broken men in his wake, his eyes fixed on the heavy iron doors of the upper floor where he knew Greta was being held. Inside the makeshift cell, Greta sat bound to a wooden chair, her face bruised, but her eyes still burning with that same hauntingly calm fire. Vitali stood behind her, a knife pressed to her throat, his hand shaking as the sounds of the slaughter drew closer. "He's coming for me," Greta whispered, her voice a rasping blade in the quiet room. "But not for the reason you think, Lorenzo. He's coming to prove you're nothing." The doors didn't just open. They were kicked from their hinges with a force that sent dust swirling through the air. Sergio stepped through the wreckage, his face splattered with the red spray of the men he'd left in the hallway. He didn't look at Greta first. He looked at Vitali, his gaze so heavy and devoid of mercy that the rival boss instinctively took a step back, the knife trembling against Greta's skin. "You thought she was a weakness," Sergio said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. "You thought you could pull a thread and watch me unravel." He stepped closer, ignoring the weapon pointed at the woman he had spent every waking hour thinking about. To anyone else, it would have looked like he didn't care if she lived or died, but Greta saw the truth in the way his jaw was set like iron. He wasn't there to plead. He was there to dominate. He raised his weapon, the barrel dead on with Vitali's forehead, his posture a masterclass in lethal arrogance. "You didn't find my soft spot, Lorenzo. You just gave me a reason to stop holding back." Vitali tried to speak, to bargain, to find some way out of the trap he had built for himself, but Sergio didn't give him the chance. With a movement so fast it was almost invisible, Sergio fired a single shot that grazed Vitali's shoulder, sent him spinning away from Greta, and then slammed the butt of his gun into the man's temple. As Vitali crumpled to the floor, a broken heap of failed ambition, Sergio finally turned to Greta. He didn't rush to untie her. He didn't weep or ask if she was all right. He simply stood over her, the smell of cordite and copper hanging thick between them, and looked down at her with a terrifying, possessive intensity. He had won the war. He had saved the girl, and he had proven to the city that he was the only god that mattered in the dark. But as he reached down to cut her bindings, the silence in the room felt heavier than the gunfire outside. The rescue was complete, but the cost of his dominance was a weight they were both about to feel. He had saved her body, but in the process, he had shown her the monster he truly was. A man who would burn the world just to prove he owned the matches. The industrial silence that followed the breach was a lie, a thin veil covering the machinery of death that was still in motion. As Sergio worked the blade through the thick hemp ropes binding Greta to the chair, the air in the cannery felt charged with static, the kind that precedes a terminal strike of lightning. He didn't look at her, but he could feel the heat of her gaze, not one of gratitude, but of a profound, shattering recognition of the darkness he had unleashed to reach her. "It's over," he murmured, the words sounding hollow against the backdrop of the dying city. But Greta knew the underworld better than the man who ruled it. She knew that in a world of shadows, the light of a rescue only makes the remaining predators more desperate. Across the debris-strewn floor, Vitaly stirred, a ghost of a man coughing up the dust of his own shattered legacy. With a trembling hand, he reached into the waistband of his trousers, pulling a small, backup snub-nose revolver that Sergio's men had missed in their clinical sweep. It was a dying man's spite, a final, jagged piece of glass meant to cut the king who had humiliated him. Sergio was still leaning over Greta, his back turned, his focus momentarily fractured by the proximity of the only woman who had ever looked at him and seen a person instead of a paycheck. He was vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in 20 years, a king without a shield. Vitaly raised the weapon, the metal glinting under the flickering fluorescent lights. The barrel leveled at the center of Sergio's broad back. Greta saw it first. She didn't scream. There was no time for the luxury of a warning. The same quiet dignity that had allowed her to walk away from his money now drove her to a final, instinctive act of sovereignty. As the hammer of Vitaly's gun fell, Greta lunged forward, her body a blur of white fabric and desperate motion, throwing herself across Sergio's frame just as the room exploded with the sharp, dry crack of the shot. The impact didn't sound like it does in the movies. It was a dull, wet thud, the sound of a stone hitting deep water. Sergio spun around, his own weapon roaring twice in response. 2 surgical rounds that ended Vitaly's life before the man could even witness the devastation he'd caused. But as the smoke cleared, the Shadow King felt a weight on his chest that was heavier than any crown. Greta didn't fall away from him. She slumped into his arms, her head resting against the lapel of his expensive wool coat, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that whistled through the quiet. Greta. The name came out of him like a prayer from an atheist. He caught her, his hands, which had never trembled while taking a life, now shaking violently as he felt the sudden, terrifying warmth of her blood soaking through his shirt. It was a deep, blooming crimson, a map of the sacrifice she had made for a man who didn't deserve it. He lowered her to the concrete floor, his knees hitting the grit as he ignored the shouts of his men and the distant approach of sirens. He pressed his palms against the wound, trying to keep her life from leaking out onto the cold, uncaring floor, but the red wouldn't stop. It was the cost he hadn't wanted to pay, the blood he hadn't wanted to spill. Greta looked up at him, her eyes beginning to glaze, the fire in them softening into a distant, peaceful ember. She reached up, her fingers staining his cheek with a final, ghostly touch. You looked like you needed peace," she whispered, her voice a thread of silk caught in a gale. In the chaos of the rescue, in the ruins of the battle he had won, Sergio Monti finally understood the gravity of his own empire. He was the most powerful man in the city, He had annihilated his rivals, and he had proven his dominance to the world. But as the light faded from Greta's eyes, he realized it was all ash. The Shadow King had won the war, but he had lost the only soul that had ever truly seen him. The price of his throne was a life of quiet grace, and as the sirens finally wailed at the gates, he sat in the dark, holding the broken shield he had never asked for, finally understanding that some victories are indistinguishable from defeat. The chaos of the warehouse had settled into a thick, suffocating stillness, the kind of silence that usually follows a storm of lead and glass. Sergio stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his weapon still warm in his hand. He had done it. He had dismantled Vitali's pride and reclaimed what was his. But the air in the room didn't taste like victory. It tasted like ozone and copper. Just as he turned to Greta, who was leaning heavily against the industrial shelving, a shadow moved in the mezzanine above. It was Vitali's youngest nephew, a boy barely 20, his eyes wide with a frantic, cornered desperation. He wasn't looking to win a war. He was looking to hurt the man who had ended his family. The muzzle flash from above was a momentary rip in the darkness. Sergio saw it, his instincts already diving for cover, but his focus was fractured. He looked at Sylvia, who was huddled near the exit, frozen in the line of fire. He moved to protect his interests, to protect the girl he had used as a pawn, but Greta was faster. She had lived a life of anticipating needs, of moving before anyone asked, and in that split second, she didn't see a Mafia boss or a rival. She saw her sister. Greta lunged, her body a blur of tattered white fabric as she threw herself into the path of the falling lead. The crack of the shot was deafening in the hollow space, followed by a sound that would haunt Sergio's dreams for the rest of his life. The heavy, unceremonious thud of a body hitting the concrete. Greta. Sylvia's scream was a jagged tear in the silence, a raw, primal sound that stripped the room of its remaining shadows. Sergio didn't wait for the boy above to fire again. His own response was a cold, mechanical double tap that ended the threat before the echo of the first shot had even died. He dropped his gun, the metal clattering against the floor, and moved toward the two women. He reached them just as Sylvia collapsed beside Greta, her hands hovering over her friend's chest, terrified of the red blooming across the floor like a dark, expanding continent. Sergio dropped to his knees, his expensive suit soaking in the filth and the blood, but he didn't feel the grime. He reached out, his fingers, which had never hesitated to pull a trigger, now trembling as they brushed Greta's cooling skin. She was looking up at the corrugated ceiling, her breath coming in shallow, hitching rattles. The calm he had admired so much, the quiet dignity that had initially offended his sense of power, was still there, but it was fading into something more permanent. She turned her head slightly, her eyes finding Sylvia first, then drifting to Sergio. There was no anger in them, no accusation. There was only a devastating, quiet pity that made Sergio feel smaller than he had ever felt in his life. "Look after her," Greta whispered, her voice a mere ghost of a sound, the words catching on the blood in her throat. She wasn't asking. She was issuing a final, sovereign command that Sergio knew he would spend the rest of his life obeying. He nodded, a single, sharp motion, his throat too tight for words. He wanted to tell her he was sorry. He wanted to tell her he hadn't meant for the test to end in a tomb. But Greta was already drifting. She looked at Sylvia one last time, a faint, ghostly smile touching her lips, a silent promise that even in the dark, they had stayed together until the very end. When the light finally left her eyes, the silence that followed was absolute. Sergio sat on the cold floor, the Shadow King, surrounded by the corpses of his enemies and the ruin of the only person who had ever truly challenged him. He had won. Vitali was gone, the territory was secure, and his dominance was undisputed. But as he looked at Sylvia sobbing over Greta's body, he realized that this was the truest form of the crown he wore. It wasn't made of gold or power. It was made of the blood of the innocent and the wreckage of things that could never be replaced. His victory was silent, cold, and utterly hollow. He had saved the girl, but he had lost the soul of the world, and as he signaled his men to clear the room, he finally understood that some fires don't just change you, they leave you as ash. The passing of years had done little to soften the jagged edges of the Manhattan skyline, but for Sergio Monti, time had become a repetitive loop of hollow victories and silent rooms. He sat in his office on the 60th floor, the same space where a waitress's calm reply had once cracked the foundation of his world. The room was colder now, stripped of the smoke and the chaos of his younger years, replaced by a clinical, expensive stillness. He was no longer the shadow king of a warring syndicate. He was a titan of industry, a man whose name was spoken with a reverence that felt like a funeral dirge. He had more power, more influence, and more security than any man in the history of the city. Yet as he looked at his reflection in the darkened window, he saw only a ghost. His gaze drifted to the sleek tablet on his desk, which displayed a live feed from a prestigious medical graduation ceremony uptown. The camera panned across a sea of black robes until it settled on a young woman whose face carried a strength forged in a fire that should have consumed her. Silvia Vitali stood on the podium, her eyes bright and clear, accepting her doctorate with a poise that made Sergio's heart ache with a phantom limb's pain. She didn't know that the anonymous trust fund that had paid for her tuition, her books, and her safety was funded by the blood of the man who had failed to protect her sister. She didn't know that every time she looked at her diploma, she was looking at Sergio's only attempt at penance. Sergio watched as Sylvia walked back to her seat, her hand instinctively touching a small, gold locket at her throat, a locket he knew contained a faded photo of Greta. He had kept his promise. He had looked after her from the shadows, ensuring that no vultures or rivals ever crossed her path again. He had built a fortress around her life, but he was a prisoner outside its walls. He could never speak to her, never ask for forgiveness, and never tell her that he spent his nights staring at a white waitress apron he kept locked in a vault. A relic of the day, he learned that power is a poor substitute for peace. The city sprawled below him, indifferent and enormous, a grid of lights that he controlled with a flick of his pen. But as the graduation ceremony ended and the screen went dark, the silence of the 60th floor returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. He realized then that Greta's final words hadn't been a blessing, but a prophecy. He had found a version of peace, but it was the peace of a graveyard. He had passed every corporate test, survived every assassination attempt, and won every war, but he remained a man who had failed the only test that truly mattered. He was the most powerful man in the world, sitting in a throne of shadows, forever haunted by the memory of a woman who had needed nothing from him but the humanity he hadn't known he possessed until it was too late. He closed his eyes. The image of Greta's calm smile burned into his mind, finally understanding that in the end, the Shadow King was the only one left in the dark. Thank you so much for walking this dark and emotional journey with us today. Throughout this story, we've seen how one moment of pride can change the course of multiple lives forever, and having you here to witness, it means the world to us. You aren't just viewers to me. You are the heartbeat of this channel, and honestly, you feel like family. Every time you tune in, you remind me why these stories of human struggle and redemption need to be told. If this story touched your heart, or if it reminded you to cherish the people you love a little more today, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our family. It's the best way to make sure we keep growing together and that you never miss a chapter of our next adventure. And please, share this story. You never know who might need to hear Greta's message of dignity or Sergio's lesson on the true cost of power. Before you go, I want to hear from you because your voice is what makes this community special. Do you think Sergio actually redeemed himself by looking after Sylvia from afar? Or was it too little, too late? What would you have done if you were in Greta's shoes? Would you have taken the money to save your sister? Or was her dignity worth more than any price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to tell me which city you're watching from. I read every single one of your comments, and I can't wait to see where our family is gathered today. Remember, you are loved, you are seen, and you are part of something bigger here. I'll see you in the next story.